Ferns can be very tricky plants to get right. In fact, they were my green nemesis until not long ago, with the typical crispy brown leaves that you probably experienced yourselves regularly plaguing my plants. I've realised now though that I was just misunderstanding them and setting myself up for failure. Get a few basic things right and we can easily have happy ferns to be proud of in our homes. As with most plant care, we need to understand the natural habitat to have any chance of getting things right. Mimic their natural habitat as much as possible and we've won half the battle. So what do we know about where ferns live? They're commonly found in moist environments like forests, jungles and swamps. They tend to thrive in damp places with high humidity and lots of shade. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? One of the reasons ferns love these areas is because they don't have seeds or flowers. Instead, they reproduce by releasing spores which need moisture to grow into new fern plants. If you've gone for a walk in the forest, you'll have no doubt seen these guys growing on the floor or on tree trunks. They love the shade provided by the towering trees, which protects them from direct sunlight. So this is your first clue when it comes to light. They need to be protected from direct sun, otherwise their fronds crisp up and brown, just like they are protected from the sun by the surrounding trees. So south-facing windows are a no-go if you're in the northern hemisphere. They'll just dry out in no time. But don't get mistaken and think they should be put in a windowless basement. They actually need more light than you think to thrive. Try to give them as much indirect sunlight as possible, but avoid afternoon sun rays hitting the fronds. The tag in the shop might say that these are tolerant of low light conditions, but that just really means that they can survive there. It doesn't mean they thrive, and that's what we all want, a thriving fern. You basically want to have a look at how much of the sky it can see. If it can see a decent amount, then it'll be happy. If it can't see any, then it'll start to lose vigour. I keep my ferns perched on my kitchen counter next to my sink and next to my external door. This is an east-facing spot, which means it does get a couple of hours of early morning sun. I say that, but in reality it's cloudy here most days. It's not getting that much sun at all. Anyway, they get a fairly decent view of the sky, which is good. I know most advice out there says to not give it any direct sun, but I do find just a couple of hours of very early morning sun is gentle enough for it to not burn. Of course, this depends on where you live though. If you live somewhere that gets scorchio summers, then I'll play it safe and keep it in the shade. We now know that ferns live in cool, damp forests, and this means they don't like to have their soil dry out too much. They prefer a consistently moist soil, and this prevents their fronds from drying out. I water my fern every week during spring and summer, and I do up that to maybe twice a week during hot weather. And this will be different for you based on where you live. You always want to check the soil before giving any of your plants a drink. I always check my soil with my trusty moisture meter and water when the probe is on the cusp between moist and dry. You don't want to keep the soil consistently wet though. This has the potential to suffocate the roots from overwatering, which will lead to root rot and plant death. You can of course use your finger to fill the moisture in the soil if you don't have a meter, but I find sometimes your finger can be a bit misleading. An alternative way is to go by the weight of the plant. This does take a little bit of experience and getting to know your plant, but I tend to pick it up and top it up with water if it feels light. If it's heavy, then there's enough water in the soil, so I'll wait another few days. I do this instead of probing sometimes because, I'm lazy. It can be quite reliable once you get to know your plant like the back of your hand. And if you want to check out the moisture meter that I use, then have a look at my Amazon store, which is linked in the description to this video. Most of you know I'm a bottom waterer, and this applies to my ferns. It helps keeps the soil evenly moist, which leads to healthier roots. If you do top water, then just make sure to drown that hoe so that all the areas get fully wet. Overwatering is not about volume of water, but rather frequency of watering. Ferns do really well on a regular feed schedule. Again, this goes back to their natural habitat. They grow on the floors of damp forests where the ground is rich in decaying plant matter. They soak up all those nutrients from the leaves, the twigs, the poo, and we need to mimic this in our homes. A good, balanced feed suitable for houseplants will really make the leaves pop. I feed my ferns once every couple of weeks during the spring and summer using Houseplant Focus, which is a seaweed-based feed. You can use anything you like really. Don't get too excited and feed too often or give too high a dose, because this will lead to fertilizer root burn, with the telltale sign being browning tips of the leaves. You can think of fertilizer root burn like eating too much candy. Eating a little bit of candy can be enjoyable and provide you with energy, but eating too much can make you feel sick. When plants receive too much fertilizer, it overwhelms their root system and can cause the roots to become damaged or even burned, affecting their ability to take up water and nutrients properly. So always follow the dosage instructions on the packet. Now, humidity is a bit of a hot topic when it comes to ferns. They need high humidity to thrive, right? In a way, yes. They're not going to do particularly well if you live in the desert unless you can regulate your home properly. The air is just too dry and their fronds will dry and crisp up. So if this is you, then I'd consider choosing a different type of plant, a desert cactus maybe. They're used to damp environments, so if you live in a climate that isn't super dry, you're halfway there. This doesn't necessarily mean you need to pull out all the stops and create a super humid zone for your fern. It's just not realistic, and to be honest, it's not necessary either. The key is to keep them in a consistent environment away from things like heating and cooling vents. They really won't like that. You might be misting your ferns thinking your plant pairing of the year, but honestly, misting doesn't provide much benefit. I've been running a little experiment for the last 3 months where I'm misting one of my ferns and not the other to see if there's any improvement in the misted one. Admittedly, it's fairly anecdotal, but I've just not noticed any difference between the two. They're both as happy as each other. You see, misting doesn't really raise air humidity in any significant way. Not long enough and not high enough to greatly benefit the plant anyway. You mist your fern, the leaves stay wet for 20 to 30 minutes, dry off, and the air humidity hasn't really changed. If you're keen, you could invest in a humidifier, but to me, they create more problems than they're worth. I've not got mine in the greatest spot when it comes to consistent humidity, with it being next to my external door. In an ideal world, I'd keep it further back, but it seems to be tolerating it. Maybe because it's always raining here. I know, I moan about weather far too much on this channel. Ferns have a bit of a Goldilocks temperature zone. They do much better in cooler homes and like a range that is just right between 15 and 24 degrees Celsius, just like their natural habitat in the forest. If you live in a hot climate and don't have aircon, then you're just going to struggle to keep ferns unless you keep them way back from the window. Even then, it's probably going to be tricky. Mine seem to love my damp and cool climate here in Sheffield, which is probably why mine isn't kicking up a fuss next to my door. It's not getting blasted by hot air whenever I open the door. I wish. I've already touched on the need to fertilise your ferns regularly, but what about soil? Soil is actually super important for the health of these guys. They love soils that are rich in organic matter. Again, this goes back to where they live. They grow out of the naturally decomposing plant matter in the forest floor, so we should replicate this as much as possible. Your aim is to have them in a mix that retains water well, but not too much, and has lots of organic matter that can provide some nutrient benefit to the roots. Compost is perfect. You can also add soil amendments like well-rotted manure and worm castings. Avoid using peat moss as it tends to become hydrophobic over time and ferns hate living in dry soil. I always recommend adding perlite to soil mixes to lighten it up and provide oxygen to the roots. Heavy soils have smaller air pockets, suffocating the roots and causing root rot. Not a pretty thing. My usual mix of 5 parts compost to 2 parts perlite is just the ticket for ferns. Chuck in some worm castings as a treat and they'll love you. Avoid keeping your ferns in unglazed terracotta pots. They are the opposite of a marriage made in heaven. A divorce made in hell maybe? I don't know. Anyway, terracotta is porous and will just draw too much moisture too quickly from the soil and you'll have brown crispy fronds in no time. If you absolutely love terracotta, then definitely glaze them first. It makes a big difference. Plastic pots are a fern's best friend and you can easily smarten them up by putting them in a decorative pot. Just make sure whatever pot you're using has drainage holes in the bottom so excess water can escape. Because ferns like quite rich organic soil, it's a good idea to not leave it too long between repots. Even if the plant isn't root bound, it will still benefit from having a soil change every couple of years. It just freshens things up and keeps your plant firing on all cylinders. If you get the care right for these guys, they can grow pretty quickly, in which case you probably want to match the size of the pot with the bushiness of the foliage. Sometimes if we leave it too long, we can end up with an uneven top-heavy plant that looks odd. A regular upsizing prevents this and keeps the soil nice and fresh. When you do repot, a top tip is to not mess around breaking up the roots. Unless it's severely root bound, just pop it in its new home and backfill with fresh soil. The roots will find their way into the new soil just fine without your intervention. Pruning is done to tidy up a straggly looking plant rather than to encourage growth or bushiness. It's absolutely inevitable that you will get some crispy brown fronds even with the best care in the world. No frond lasts forever. If this happens, then don't panic, just cut it out. We tend to get far too downhearted if we lose a leaf, but honestly it's just part of life. You can think of crispy fronds as frayed hair that just needs to be cut back every once in a while. Follow the frond to the base of the plant and cut near the soil line to hide your sin. A new one will quickly grow to replace the one you cut. Of course, it's not essential to cut the blemishes out. You can leave them be, it's up to you. The only realistic way to propagate a fern is by division. You can, in theory, propagate through spores, but this just sounds too time consuming and too difficult. Let me know in the comments if you've achieved this and how you did it. Propagating by division just involves pulling the plant's trousers down and cutting the root ball into halves, quarters, or whatever you want. Pot these on individually and bam, you've now got multiple plants. And don't worry about cutting into the roots. They soon recover and grow new ones no problem. In fact, root pruning is a process that can actually benefit your plant in lots of ways, and in this video here I show you what happened to my plant a year after root pruning it, so click on the link so you don't miss out.